What disturbing thing did you find out about someone after they passed away? I'm European and uncles lived in USA. I did ancestry DNA. A few months later a girl from Vietnam contacts me claiming to be a cousin. Typically anyone who contacted me was a 4th or 5th cousin, which basically means nothing. This one is a first cousin. Turns out my uncle, who was married in USA and had kids, was in Vietnam War, had a whole other family, and the 3 Vietnamese kids are named after his American kids. Surprise. How did that unfold in your family? If you don't mind my asking, I sent pictures that my new cousin had to his brother, my other uncle, that was also in Vietnam at same time. Pictures of my now deceased uncle with his Vietnamese wife and info he'd written on back of pic, which included his name, the name and address of the NGO he worked for. Absolutely nobody in our fam was aware of any of this. I've told my siblings that they have 3 Vietnamese cousins, but have no contact info to advise my cousins of their namesakes from the other side of the world. Grandfather died when I was around 10. I distinctly remember being at his funeral and seeing a group of men there that weren't associated with the rest of my family. I think I remember this because I watched them pull up in beautiful cars and thought they must be rich and cool. Probably around his age at the time too. I wasn't told until I was older, but my grandpa had been involved in some organized crime for most his life, and most of the time he was traveling in Europe he was actually in prison. Those men were his partners and my family hated them. We recently had to bury my grandpa and we were the secret most people didn't know about until we got to the wake. Basically, my grandpa was married to somebody, but sleeping around, and then he slept with my grandma, who was best friends with his wife. They had 2 kids, my mom and my aunt, but they never really interacted with my grandpa's side of the family, since even if he wanted us to be close to them, his wife and parents wanted nothing to do with my mom and aunt, and my grandma wanted nothing to do with them. I always had a theory we weren't his only secret kids, and turns out there's another son, but the son doesn't interact with him or want anything to do with him. I didn't learn that until we left the Rapace. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more kids. My great grandma and her brothers were notorious in Watertown, Massachusetts for their check fraud and forgery schemes. It's crazy when you find out these sorts of things about the woman who would make you hot cocoa. I had a neighbor several years ago, divorced, old guy, was really nice to people. He always bought candy for all the kids in the neighborhood, not a pedo. He died 10 years ago. His son told us that the reason he was nice to us kids was because he lost 3 of his 5 children while they were below 10. Not disturbing, just very sad. Mr. Vokov was a really nice guy who suffered a lot in his lifetime. His son told us so many stories about him. Got married at 21, right after military service, mandatory at the time. Lost his wife when he was 40 to stomach cancer. Lost 2 of his kids to an accident. Another kid to a drunk driver. He had to be strong for the remaining 2 kids. Even though his son told us how many times they heard their dad crying in his bedroom, to him, we were the kids and grandkids he should have had, despite him having 4 grandkids. I loved and respected my grandma all my life, so when she got sick and passed away, I was really heartbroken. A few years later, I found out me and my sister were her least favorite grandkids. Because my dad was poor, it made sense to me suddenly. All my cousins would get gold bracelets or nice stuff for special occasions, while I'd get a $20 whenever my cousins were visiting. Grandma would cook all their favorite food while me and my C's had to stay away from the dining table till they're done. Basically we just eat scraps. I just didn't realize all this until my mom pointed it out to me. I guess since I've been treated that way since young, I never think of her any differently. My dad passed away from COVID a few months back. My brothers were looking through his mail and saw a child support document. We're all half brothers, so we each individually asked our moms if our dad owed child support to them. We are all in our late 20s/early 30s. Each one of our moms said no, naturally. So we do some further digging. It turns out that my dad has an autistic son that is 25 years old. Knowing who my dad is, none of us were all that surprised that he had another son. However, all of us were completely shocked to find out that my dad was aware of this kid and didn't tell us. To make matters worse, he grew up down the road from us. My dad had photos stashed away of him, my newly found brother, and his mom, There are photos from the last 25 years. My dad knew since day one. I flew back home for the funeral, and while I was there we all met our new brother and his mom. I still can't quite process this all. To the question, what was my brother like? Here is my answer. Keep in mind that I didn't get much time to spend around him as I had to fly back home shortly after meeting him. Most of the time spent was talking with his mom because he wasn't very communicative. Hopefully I'm not offending people with my ignorance of autistic traits, but he seemed to be less independent and more reliant on his mother's care. According to his mom, he likes to read a lot and play video games. Apparently he was bullied in school, which really upsets me. Knowing this information definitely adds to the whole shock factor. I feel that he could have used the support of his older brothers to keep him safe while he was growing up. Somebody to love and care for him, help him fight his battles. I feel like we were robbed of the opportunity. My dad hadn't been together with any of our mothers for nearly 20 years, so I can't understand his reasoning in keeping our brother a secret. Anyway, I live on the other side of the country, which makes communication with him difficult. Although my brothers still live there, she and her son are moving to Las Vegas, so none of us really get the chance to spend time with him. My grandpa died in the late 90s of a heart attack when he was about 65 years old. My whole family came to Germany from Poland in the 80s and my grandparents were kids throughout WW2. We didn't find any pictures of him from when he was a child when we went through his stuff. After he died, we thought, oh well, they lived through war and communism. I bet there aren't any, but my mother had a feeling and something felt off for her. We asked my grandpa's aunt, who was still alive at that point. She burst into tears and told us that he was a German Jewish kid my great-grandparents rescued from a train heading to Auschwitz during WW2, and that they used the papers of their son who passed away just a few weeks earlier. We all were stunned, but in hindsight it did explain a lot of things, like how he suffered from PTSD and almost had no Polish accent when he spoke German. It still amazes me how they kept this secret for over half a century. I found out that my uncle somehow had a black market liver. He went through the first VAR drinking himself nearly to death. He wouldn't stop drinking, so the implant folks wouldn't put him on a list. He then takes a trip to, I believe, India and gets a liver implanted. He then found a shady doctor here for aftercare. After that, he drank through another liver in 3 years. He was preparing for another trip to India, but COVID stopped him from traveling. He was anti-vaxxed too. He died not long ago due to his liver not working anymore. From what I'm seeing, and what his wife says, I'm 99% sure that liver was harvested from a living donor. My grandmother was always difficult to get along with, critical and very fussy about ladylike behavior. Always cross your ankles. Decent girls make sure men can't see too much leg. After she died, I had the surprise of my life digging through her papers and finding social workers' reports from 1928 and so much other stuff. I knew that her own mother had died young, but I hadn't realized that said mother had died in a mental hospital after being sent there for what sounds like severe depression, or that her father had tried to abandon her and her siblings in several places, was reported to social services repeatedly by their neighbors, and finally had them taken away by the state and sent to an orphanage because he was getting help from a teenage male cousin whom the social worker discovered was sharing a bed with my then 9-year-old grandmother and her sister. I can't even imagine. She never breathed a word of any of this, but looking back it made sense because she hated to ever leave her house. My grandfather ran all the errands, etc. She would stay in the fenced backyard and look after her garden, and would sometimes fly into rages and accuse us of planning to lock her up and abandon her. In all honesty, I had thought she was losing it a bit. Now I don't think she was. I wish to God she had gotten therapy at some point in her life, because she hid this her whole life and was a miserable, angry person. But never, ever would I have guessed that the woman who was fussing over my skirt length and telling me that people will think I'm trashy if I slouched, grew up like that. I knew my dad was dating younger women, but after he died, we were sorting through his paperwork, and I found out that for the past 7 years, the various women had all been the exact same age as me at the time he was seeing them. How did I find this out? He had a restraining order against one where it listed her birth date He received correspondence from one who was in prison on child trafficking charges. A Google search of the woman in prison revealed her age and family members who spoke to the current woman. I managed to successfully avoid them all. Relayed her age. About 3 years before he died, he'd sold his house, made $200,000 on the sale, and moved into an apartment. There was an envelope stuffed full of receipts showing he had slowly drained that account by withdrawing between $1,000 to $3,000 in cash over the 3 years since the house sale. He had once drunkenly told me he was in love with a stripper, and through the grapevine I heard the woman he'd been seeing when he died was a prostitute. So I'm assuming that's where all the cash went. No judgment to intimate workers. They gotta get paid. But damn, that was not the money management my dad taught me. I was angry, but of course devastated he was gone. I felt like this wasn't the same man who raised me. I went to therapy and that helped. But I don't yearn for my dead father the same way I do my mother. And I think all of the above is a big reason why. My grandparents were married just after my grandfather returned from World War II. When he got back, he and my grandmother had 7 kids. It was a big Catholic family. My grandfather was a kind, honorable man that loved his wife, and they raised good kids that have all turned into well-adjusted adults. By now my grandparents have both passed away, and some of the kids and grandkids have messed around with 23andMe genetic testing. As luck would have it, some guy out of the blue has started messaging us with a high enough percentage of genetic match that it stands to reason that he is a son of my grandfather. No one in my family has ever heard of him or his mother. Evidently before his mother passed away on her deathbed, she identified a man by my grandfather's name as his father. Sounds like old grandpa picked up some strange before shipping out. The awful part is this guy has spent his whole life not knowing who his father is. Poor guy. I remember a few years back, while I was still living in Russia, I went to my grandma's funeral, and in some own speech about her they began to talk about how she was in a concentration camp, and how she had gone through so many horrendous things I won't repeat. I never knew, and it's clear no one else did either. She went through horrible stuff and it disturbs me to this day. We cleaned out her house and there were so many things from that time in her life that documented all that, and I looked at it and I felt sick. My grandfather ran a gas station from the late 40s to the mid 80s. He and my grandmother had 13 kids, 10 surviving, so there was never much money in the house. My mom and her siblings shared beds, hand-me-downs were the rule. The family kept a large garden to feed everyone, etc. I never thought of them as poor growing up, but they really had to scrimp to get by. Anyway, after my grandfather died in the early 2000s, my grandmother learned of a secret bank account he'd kept for decades. It wasn't malicious. He had just always been fearful of dying young, and he wanted to make sure my grandmother would have something to live on in case he actually did die young. When the rest of the family found out, at least a few of my aunts and uncles were pissed because of how financially hard their childhood was. I don't know if it's that disturbing, but it was definitely a shock to our family. My maternal uncle passed away during a robbery gone wrong. He was staying the night at one of his furnished rental properties which was not being leased at the time. At least that was the story I was told before hopping on a plane with my mom to attend the funeral held in our home country. The day of the funeral, a cousin angrily shared with a small group of us that he had seen a photo of my uncle on the front page of the local paper. Not being used to seeing graphic images on a newspaper, I was confused by his outrage. So naturally, I looked it up on my phone and proceeded to read a whole article about how my uncle had been tortured and killed in retaliation for past child abuse. I was, of course, shocked and started asking other cousins if the article was true. The chagrin disturbed me far more than the graphic image of my uncle, a photo of him shirtless with multiple stab wounds. Another uncle who happens to be a judge got the paper to stop printing the image by threatening to sue allegedly. Apparently, dead uncle's murderer/victim had recently heard his name on the news and found out through social media that said uncle had continued enjoying life for 5 decades since committing these crimes. So while no real proof was provided according to the media, my family knew it was likely the true reason behind the murder and only publicly denied the allegations. Privately, the reason for the murder wasn't even discussed, but that wasn't the only abuse victim. Nope. Dead uncle had allegedly abused several children at different times. spanning decades, but somehow was never prosecuted. My mother's family is wealthy, so the cousins are pretty sure that authorities/parents of the victims were paid off anytime he was accused, as the victims were primarily children of low-income families. To add to the horror, my relatives knew to keep us children away from him outside of supervised family events. Think Uncle Emo in Succession. Years later, when I finally felt it was safe to ask my fragile mother about it, I learned that this uncle had been abused by priests in his childhood. Well into his teenage years. I had known that dead uncle was sent to seminary boarding school at around 10, then decided to leave religion and go to a regular uni at 18 instead of continuing his training for priesthood, but never suspected anything had happened to him. His decision to leave the church coincided with the end of a centuries-long relationship between the Catholic Church and my maternal ancestors. There are still religious primary and secondary schools with my last name on them. I have both parents' last name, but we have not produced a priest or nun since before my mother's generation. What she revealed explained this shift. After even more digging, I found out that yet another of my mother's family members, a great uncle, who made so much money for the church that he literally became a friend of the Pope, was also involved in a huge scandal spanning decades and was only removed from his position because of a journalist's dedication to exposing him. He received no jail time and died in his Florida home at a very old age. WTF. I'm an atheist, if anyone wondered.